with EV World News, where we talk about electric vehicles, green energy, and the stock markets. Got an interesting one today. So, a lot of people may or may not be aware that GM's Hummer division makes an EV. Now, this thing has a huge battery, it's really heavy, and you don't see these very often. And part of that is because it's got a over $100,000 normal price tag. And this is coming from Rob Report. The Barrett Jackson Auto Auction in Las Vegas just auctioned off a used Hummer EV for $324,500, about three times its retail price. It was originally intended to be listed at $110,000. It's crazy to think about it selling for that much. This was, let me see, they'd previously owned Hummer EV sold for 324K. It had only 48 miles on its odometer, and it's the highest priced used Hummer EV ever auctioned. There've been two previous sales on auctions of Hummer EVs for 275,000 and 260,000. This is kind of interesting because they GM's only been able to deliver 372 of these cars. Um, Very heavy. It's tough. It was something that was difficult to deliver during the COVID era. It's shocking to think about. I was watching a video recently on somebody talking about how even gas-powered trucks aren't selling real well right now. And the particular dealership it was at had a Hummer EV on the lot. It was about $120,000. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, for next, we're going to talk a little bit about the power grid, something that we talk about quite often. But this is something I don't, because I get arguments all the time that, and this is absolutely correct, that to completely charge up a Tesla that has a 100 kilowatt hour battery takes almost 100 pounds of coal to convert into those 100 kilowatts, because a pound of coal is about equal to 1 kilowatt hour of energy. But the truth is, in the United States, 40% of all electricity is actually emissions free. Now, part of this is changes in the amount of natural gas, coal, and solar have the biggest changes. And of course, you got the possibility of nuclear as well. Now, let's see what we got here. So here's the percentages of US electricity generation by source. So 44% is natural gas, only 16% is coal. Coal is less than nuclear, which is 18. Wind, hydro, and solar, 6, 6, and 10. Now, it's interesting because some countries in the world are 100% hydroelectric, and I'll get into that in just a couple of minutes. But, we look at this, so we've got, 18 here, 10 here, another 12 here. And it's now a lot of people, though, on the green energy space don't like to talk about nuclear, but nuclear seems like a good solution. We're not, when they build a nuclear reactor now, it's been 60 years or 50, 60 years since the 3 Mile Island incident. And Chernobyl was something like 50 years ago. It's really hard to view that. And, there's new safeguards and everything. They learned some lesson from these, major incidents like Fukushima, things like that. And the nuclear side of things is getting much more developed. Now, one thing is these renewables, solar and wind, are constantly growing each year. But it's just interesting to see where this all plays out. Now, natural gas is cleaner than coal. It's all varying levels of what is going on. But obviously, the number one producer of energy in the US is natural gas, and that probably won't change much quickly. Now, what's interesting to see about this is see how this compares with the rest of the world, because the United States has 40% end quote renewables. We're going to look at now where the rest of the world is in power generation, and this is a very different look. Now, this here is this was from 2021, and so these numbers may have changed a little bit, but this is percent of energy that came from these renewables, and it's classifying hydropower, wind, geothermal, solar, and tidal. Um, I haven't the tidal one doesn't get a whole lot of use. It's like about a third of a percent worldwide, and on the scoring, it doesn't even make the list on any of the top 45 countries as to what their amount of renewables are. But this is to give you an idea. Albania had 100% renewables, but it was 99.5% hydroelectric and a little bit of less than 1% solar, about half of a percent solar. Now, Albania is a small country. They have less than 3 million people live there, at least in 2021. Bhutan, which is an African country, gets 100% of its energy from hydropower. Nepal, 98% from hydro. And then they get a tiny amount from wind, they get another percent and a half from solar, but they're 100% renewable. Now, this one doesn't factor nuclear in as a renewable, so that's quite interesting. Um, so if you put nuclear in some of these, you see very some other countries pop on the list, notably for countries like France, which is really big in the nuclear. Sweden has a pretty high amount of nuclear. They may show up on here anyways. Um, Nepal has a population of about just shy of 30 million people. 100%, most of it's hydroelectric. Paraguay, 100% hydroelectric. Once again, small population, 7%. Iceland has a 99.99% from renewables, but they only have 372,000 people live there. It's actually almost just a big town. And it's very different. People think about Iceland. It's not a real big country. 70% still hydroelectric and 30% is geothermal. Now, obviously, Iceland's a land of volcanoes and they have a lot of issues with volcanoes, but they've also learned how to use those to tap into them to power the country. Now, Ethiopia is a big country here, 118 million people. They're 96% hydroelectric, a little bit of wind, tiny bit of solar. They're still 99.96% renewable. Congo, big country, 92 million people, 99.5% hydroelectric. Now here we go. Here's a what's classified as a first world country other than Iceland. Now Norway has a population of 5.4 million, 91% hydroelectric, 7% wind, 98.93% overall. And they're one of the world's largest oil producers, which is really kind of interesting because the wealth of the country of Norway is based off of the country's oil holdings. Now, let's look for another bigger country because we keep going down here. We have, Namibia, which is an African, mostly desert country, still has 64% hydroelectric. Zambia, Uganda. Now, some of these countries, probably the amount of electricity used per person is nowhere near what it is in the United States. And so that's also something to consider. Uganda, 46 million, has almost 90% hydroelectric. Now, some of these, the numbers are starting to drop a little bit. Tajikistan, small population. Kenya has 55 million. Mozambique. We'll look down here a little bit further. Um, Austria has about 9 million people. It's 60% hydroelectric, 9% wind. Let's see. Let's find a big country here. Here we go. Brazil, 214 million people, 55% hydroelectric, 11% wind, 2.5% solar. And they get, a little bit more than two-thirds of their energy from renewable zero emission sources. Canada, this is interesting. 38 million people, almost 60% hydroelectric. Quebec is real heavy in hydroelectric. It has the cheapest electricity rates in North America. So it's kind of interesting to see this. And we keep going down the line. There's not really much in the way of a first world large country. When you come to the average for the world average is 26%, of which 15% is hydroelectric. and so on. Now, I was under the impression it shows China, that China was bigger in hydroelectric. It only gets 15% of its power needs from hydroelectric. Big in wind, a little bit of solar, almost 4%, about the same as the United States in solar. Let's see what we get here. India, kind of low here. It's interesting if you look for these renewables, the United States is at 18.91%. Now, we were just looking at that other chart, showed the US at 40%, but they added solar on there. When you added 20% of the US energy coming from solar, it was different. Now, this is also 2021, whereas the other chart was for 2023. But the United States is a little bit behind the world on renewables. Now, what's interesting, here's some states here in the United States, and they also pulled out Scotland. Scotland's 91% that way. The state of South Dakota in the US as 120% of its energy needs comes from renewables. So they're exporting that energy, 43% hydroelectric and 77% wind. I used to live in North Dakota, not South Dakota, but the Dakotas are very windy. Where I live in Nebraska, it's also can be very windy, but not quite as windy as the Dakotas. Washington State, 97%, they have 85% hydroelectric. And then Montana with a big amount of hydroelectric, 69.5%, and 22% wind, or 22%, yeah, wind, very little solar. And just kind of interesting to see that. Some interesting stats on where energy is being sourced. And anyways, if you like this content, please leave me a comment. Let me know what you might like to see in the future. And please like because it helps get this video shown to more people and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise,